If Jesus is truly God and truly human, that seems to result in a contradiction. It seems like he would have to have all the limitlessness of God and yet all the limitations of a human being. That's the apparent contradiction. The question is it a real contradiction? And if it is that a problem? My guest tonight, I'm very honored to have Dr. J.C. Beall. He's just authored a new book with Oxford University Press called The Contradictory Christ. And we're going to be answering that question. So thank you very much for coming on, Dr. Beall.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor.
I will go ahead and mention there will be live Q&A at the end. So go ahead and be thinking of a question that you want to ask as we go through the interview. And if you type your question in the live chat, make sure you put the word question at the beginning. Then I can easily find it. So if you have a question as we go through, just type it in the live chat and put the word question at the beginning. All right, let's go ahead and jump in here. So how did you become interested in the topic of the Incarnation?
I was raised with a lot of mostly Reformed Christian theology, and the Incarnation was always the central event through which the rest of divine reality is to be understood. So the topic has long been one of serious interest. However, it's only recently that I've had the opportunity to start publishing on the topic.
Well, this book was, I'm very pleased that you wrote it, and I'm so glad that Mike DeVito, I want to publicly thank him. He sent me a copy of this book. Thank you, Mike. I really appreciate it, and thank you for getting this interview set up. So let's talk first about the fundamental problem of Christology, because this is going to frame the discussion. What is the fundamental problem of Christology?
The fundamental problem of Christology, which, by the way, was originally so-called by Richard Cross, a colleague of mine, in 2009 in an essay called The Incarnation. The problem is nothing more nor less than the apparent contradiction of Christ, who is one person who's both fully divine and fully human. And in virtue of being fully divine, Christ enjoys all the essential limitlessness of God, but in virtue of being fully human, Christ also enjoys all of the essential limits that we share. To give one specific and often discussed example of a contradiction, consider peccability, that is, being able to sin, and impeccability, not being able to sin. In virtue of being divine, Christ is impeccable. That is, it's false that Christ is able to sin. But Christ is human, just as we're human. And in virtue of being human, Christ is peccable. That is, it's true that Christ is able to sin. So in virtue of his being both divine and human, Christ is thereby apparently contradictory. It's true that he's able to sin, but it's false that he's able to sin. Said just so, of course, highlights the contradiction in a very jarring way. But such is the contradictory Christ, always toppling the expectations of what we're primed to expect. So the fundamental problem of Christology is simply the apparent contradiction of Christ. The question that it raises is, what is the truth about the apparent contradiction? What explains the apparent contradiction? And that's the basic challenge.
I like how you said this in the book, and you just said it now. I had never put it in these words, but I think those words just clarify it. When we speak of limitlessness and limitations, and we can think of limits being on knowledge and power and so on, God will have this kind of limitlessness to him. But Christ, at least with respect to his human nature, and we can get into that, because he's human, in virtue of being human, he's going to have these limits on knowledge and power.
That's exactly right. And notice that when you say, at least according to his human nature, it's really, this is where, heretics. They weren't bad people. They were sincerely trying to get around the contradiction and make sense of this of Christ. And when it said in virtue of the human nature or whatever, that's really an explanatory thing. That's what explains the limitlessness. It's because Christ is divine. It explains the limits. Christ sweated on a cross, walked, talked, all these things. And, well, how? Well, in virtue of being human. But it's Christ who has all these things.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay.
So I liked the way you put that. And then also what was clear in your book was everyone agrees there's this an apparent contradiction here. At minimum, everybody agrees to that. And the question is, how do you best explain that apparent contradiction? And so tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to look at your answer to that question. How do you explain the apparent contradiction first? And then after that, we're going to look at your thoughts on how others explain that apparent contradiction.
Yeah.
Okay. So first, let's get clear on this term. We said it's an apparent contradiction, but what is a formal contradiction?
Great. Yeah, it's very important to be clear about the terminology. A formal contradiction, or simply contradiction for short, is any statement of the form, it's true that P and it's false that P, where P here is any statement you wish. P could be grass is green, P could be 1 + 1 + 1 = 3, P could be Jordan is sitting in front of a computer, and so on. A contradiction is simply any statement of the form, it's true that P and it's false that P, where P is the same in both places.
I have a handy example here from someone in the live chat. Justin Mooney said, I am here and I am not here.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the way you would formulate that using basic logical vocabulary is using, so logic has two what are called unary connectives. They take exactly one sentence and make a new sentence. And logic has a connective that's a truth operator. It's often ignored because it's logically redundant, and a falsity operator, which is often called logical negation. And take the sentence that Mr. Mooney gave, I'm here and not here, that would be formulated explicitly as it's true that I'm here and it's false that I'm here.
Yep. Thank you for clarifying that. Okay. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about a formal contradiction. It's true that P and it's false that P.
Right.
All right. Now, what's so interesting in your view is that there are true contradictions. So a lot of people will instantly, and this happened when I advertised this video, many people instantly started trying to push back and say there can't be true contradictions. So we'll look at some objections in a moment, but why do you think true contradictions are logically possible?
Right. That's a good question. Look, we have two fundamental semantic categories, truth and falsity. These are reflected, as I said to Mr. Mooney's question, in logic's fundamental unary connectives, namely logic's truth and falsity connectives. It's true that, it's false that. Now, these fundamental categories, they simply piggyback on the two options for predicates. For any object whatsoever, a predicate can be true of the object or it can be false of the object. For example, the predicate is sitting is true of Jordan while false of me. Now, given the two fundamental options for predicates, being true of an object, being false of an object, there are clearly four combinatorial possibilities. A predicate could be just true of an object. It can be just false of an object. It can be neither true nor false of the object. It can be both true and false of the object. These four possibilities for predicates don't cry out for some newfangled semantics or anything like that. In standard semantics, predicates are interpreted via a pair of collections. One collection being the predicate's so-called extension, which contains all the objects of which the predicate is true. And the other collection is the predicate's anti-extension, and this contains all the objects of which the predicate is false. This is just standard fare in semantics. But there's nothing in such semantics that demands or rules out a predicate's being gappy or being glutty with respect to some objects. After all, if a predicate's gappy with respect to an object, then the object is neither in the predicate's extension, the set of things of which it's true. It's not in its anti-extension, the set of things of which it's false. It's rather somewhere in the gap. It falls into a truth-value gap between the fundamental categories. Moreover, if a predicate is glutty with respect to an object, then the object is in both the predicate's extension and the predicate's anti-extension. They simply overlap in these cases. So the standard approach to predicates in semantics certainly allows for these combinatorial possibilities. And since logic is the broadest space of possibility, the four combinatorial possibilities are logical possibilities. Ruling them out of logical space is what requires motivation, not allowing them in. And since I see no good reason to rule any of them out, I consider them equally logical possibilities. So I could say more, but that's basically why I think, true contradictions are possible, because you can have objects that fall into the intersection of a predicate's extension and anti-extension. It's just the predicate is thereby both true and false of the object.
Okay, I want to slow this down and unpack it just a little bit.
Okay.
So I've read the book and I listened to several interviews, and I practiced trying to summarize this as clearly as I possibly could. So I'm going to attempt this, and you tell me where I make a mistake. Okay.
Yep.
We know that there are sentences that are true, like Jordan is sitting in front of a computer right now. We want to say that's a true sentence. We know that there are sentences that are false, like Dr. Beall is sitting in front of a computer. You're not sitting, you're standing. So that sentence is false. So we've got truth and we've got falsity as options. But as you mentioned, you can make, because there are two options here, you can combine them in different ways. So it seems like there's a total of 4 possibilities, actually. A sentence could be true. A sentence could be false. A sentence could be neither true nor false. We call those sentences gappy if they're neither true nor false.
Yep.
And then a sentence could be both true and false, and we call that a glut. So true, false, gappy, and glutty are the 4 options. Now, you think, well, classical logic, which many people probably, when they think about what logic is, if they've taken a critical thinking course or something like that, they've probably just been introduced to this without really a name, probably. Classical logic wants to say of all the sentences, there's only 2 options, the true ones or the false ones. These gappy and glutty sentences, they're not even possible. These are the only ones that are possible, true or false. But some philosophers think you can have true sentences, you can have false sentences, and you can have gappy sentences, but not gluts.
Mm-hmm.
And then other philosophers say you can have true sentences, false sentences, no gaps, and gluts.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are some, and this is the view you adopt, right?
That's right.
That says there are true sentences, false sentences, neither true nor false sentences, and these gluts. So
Correct.
true, false, gaps, gluts. You affirm all four. They're all possible.
They're all possible. That's right. Yeah.
Now, one of the examples you give to warm people up to the idea of there being gappy sentences is this example of Jordan is an adult, say. So can you walk me through, because when I heard you explain this, I thought, yeah, that definitely warms a person up to the idea of there being gappy sentences.
That's right. Yeah. So, and you've said that perfectly, by the way. That's right. I mean, when we talk about different categories for sentences, these all piggyback on the options for predicates, because a sentence's, status, whether it's true, false, both, or neither, is going to depend on the predicates involved and whether they're true of, false of the objects discussed. And as you say, we see many just true sentences. Apples are fruit. That's true. Just true. 1 + 1 + 1 = 3. That's true. It's just true. What of just false sentences? Well, like you said, I'm sitting. That's just false. Jordan's standing. That's just false. 3 = 1. That's just false. Okay, but what of gappy sentences? These are actually, as you said, very common, but often ignored in favor of the settled just true or just false cases. And instead of adult, let's consider the predicate is a child. Now, there are many milliseconds at which this predicate is true of you. For example, immediately after you were born, and then the millisecond after that, and then the next one, and the next one, and so on. On the other hand, there are many milliseconds at which the predicate is a child is false of you, right now, and the millisecond immediately before that, and the one immediately before that, and the one immediately before that, and so on. Suppose now that there's no millisecond at which the predicate is a child is gappy with respect to you. So suppose so, right? Well, then there's a unique millisecond, call it the Big Bang, such that exactly 1 millisecond before the Big Bang, the predicate child is false of you, but the very next millisecond, namely the Big Bang, the predicate is suddenly true of you. So in the flash of exactly 1 millisecond, the predicate child went from being true of you to its being false of you. And that's just clearly not the way the predicate child works. The predicate has gaps. It's true of you at some times, false of you at later times, and neither true nor false of you at some times, somewhere in the middle. And if you doubt any of this, just ask yourself why legal courts have to stipulate legal definitions of the term child. The laws don't use the term child. They use a sort of stipulated one, call it star child, because the standard term just has far too many gaps. And they need to rule on cases across all milliseconds, not just the ones that are settled. So I think that, finding gappy sentences is fairly common, or that there are gappy sentences is a fairly common view. And I certainly think it's true.
Yeah, so when you explained that of clearly I'm an adult right now, that the sentence Jordan is an adult is true right now. But if you went back a nanosecond and looked at that sentence, it would still be true. You go back another nanosecond, it's still true. You keep going back. Now, clearly there's a point at which the sentence was false. When I was a 2-year-old, that sentence was false. But where exactly did it switch from being, if these are the only two possibilities, false or true, where exactly would you think the switch happened? And it seems like what's reasonable to say is, well, there was a point where it was neither true nor false. That sentence, it just wasn't true or false. And that is exactly what we're talking about when we say a gap.
That's exactly right.
It seems like you could. I've heard Peter Van Inwagen give this example I used in a video on the problem of evil. I'm bald. I used to have hair. What point, the sentence, Jordan is bald, that's true right now. When I was 18 years old, that sentence was false. Where exactly did that switch from being true to false? It seems like you can do the same thing there.
That's correct. You could, yeah. Being bald is another common vague predicate. But most of our language uses predicates that are gappy with respect to some things. And for those, as you said, there's a sort of framework called Strong-Claney. It can be called different things. K3. It can be called Bachvard 3 without a conditional and all this. Don't worry about all that. These views only allow gaps. They say clearly they're gappy predicates, and so gappy sentences and so on. But they don't allow gluts. And my view is, look, gluts and gaps are just sort of, they're duals of one another. They're just sort of mirror images of one another. And so you need very special reason to rule one out and acknowledge the other as a logical possibility, not the other. We've talked about just true sentences, just false sentences, and gappy sentences. I might as well also say something about glutty sentences.
Yeah, I see these as the key, because what you're wanting to say of Christ when we get to the incarnation here is that there are statements about Christ which are both true and false, which would be glutty sentences.
That's correct.
So
that's correct.
Yeah, in order to get there, let's first ask, are there glutty sentences in reality? Are those actually real?
That's right. Good. And let me stick to the non-theological examples. So glutty sentences are very much less common than gaps, in my view, but they're just as easy to see. So the easiest case by far involves so-called liar-like sentences. I've elsewhere called these spandrels of truth. Consider a sentence that says of itself only that it's false. For example, the sentence I'm now asserting is false. Well, if the sentence is true, then it's false because that's what it said it was. And if it's false, then it's true, namely that it's false. Hence, the sentence is true if and only if it's false. Now, the most natural account of such a sentence is that it's a glut. It's just a very weird sentence that's both true and false. And this is what you'd expect when you somehow put two contrary properties like truth and falsity together into one entity, namely a contradiction. I should note, though, that weird phenomena like the liar sentence, they aren't always naturally treated as gluts. After all, consider a cousin of the liar paradox called the truth teller paradox, which involves a sentence that says of itself only that it's true. For example, the sentence I'm now asserting is true. Is it true? Well, if it is, it is. Is it false? Well, if it is, then it is. There's not even a hint of contradiction here. But to say of itself only that it's true is to say something that most naturally is classified as gappy. So I just wanted to flag that the weird power of our language to sort of pull off weird things with predicates and so on doesn't always result in gluts, but rather sometimes gaps.
Let me just expand on that just a little. Again, as I read the book and listened to some of the other interviews you did, I tried to practice how to make this very clear, because it was difficult to get my mind around at first. So you offered, we're asking, can you give an example of a glut that's outside of theology, that's just neutral of anything about God and spirits and anything like that?
Yeah.
So what's most often appealed to is the liar's paradox. This sentence is false, or the sentence I am false.
That's right.
Either way. And some people, as you mentioned, so you can, if the sentence is true, then it's false, which would mean it's both true and false. And then if it's false, then it's also true. So it's both true and false. Either way, you get something that's both true and false, which is what we're calling a glut. Now, some people want to respond, it seems, and say, no, that kind of sentence that you're offering is neither true nor false. It's a gappy sentence. And that seemed to be a good response to me until we meet the revenge of the liar's paradox.
That's right.
So what is the revenge of the liar's paradox?
That's right. So basically, the so-called revenge is so just as Jordan said, you could say logic doesn't force you to say that the liar is either true or false. After all, it allows for the gappy option. So you could say it's gappy. But suppose you do say it's gappy, right? Well, the liar also has another cousin, not just the truth teller, but it's got another cousin, and that cousin takes the following form. The sentence I'm now asserting is either false or it's gappy. Now, that's a disjunction. Disjunctions are true if and only if at least one of the disjuncts is true. False if and only if both of them are false. And your listeners can reflect on that, but if you call it gappy, well, one of the disjuncts is true. So the whole thing would be true. But you wanted to call it gappy. So in general, no matter what categories you bring up, you could say, okay, I mean, some people like to say any sentence that involves any circularity or self-reference is somehow meaningless. Well, how about the following? All sentences are sentences. That sentence is undoubtedly true, and it's circular because it talks about itself. So, I mean, this sort of, trying to deny obvious reality about the situation doesn't help. I mean, my view is you've got these options. Getting at the truth is hard, but don't just try to hide from it. If the thing is most naturally treated as a glut, treat it as a glut. If a gappy treatment is best, treat it as a gap, and move forward. So.
I'll just say one more thing about that revenge of the liar's paradox, just to clarify it, at least for me. And then we'll move forward. But I just see this as so important because people are going to want to say, well, give me, besides the incarnation, give me some other example. And so here's the example. If you're wanting a glut, a sentence, something that's both true and false, a real contradiction here, then think about this revenge of the liar's paradox. Okay, so the sentence, either this sentence is false or it's gappy. Remember, gappy means neither true nor false. So say you look at that sentence and you say, that sentence is just nonsense. That's like that gappy kind of stuff where that's not the kind of thing that's true or false. Okay, well, you just affirmed one of the disjuncts, the latter one. So that makes it a true sentence now because it was either this or that. So now it's both true and it's gappy. But if I'm understanding, and I may get too lost in the weeds here. If it's both true and gappy, then that's still a contradiction, correct? Because when we say true, we mean just true. But Gappy would mean that it's not true and not false.
That's exactly right. So when we say true, we mean just true. My reaction was only to say, I think, truth is truth, but in the context here, we're talking about just true. And so you're absolutely right about that. You don't avoid the contradiction, and you don't avoid it for exactly the reason that you just very nicely walked through. And I mean, these things, let me just say one other thing before we move on, if it's okay. I think you've nicely summarized the situation with these kind of common cases of gluts, common cases of gaps. But suppose that somebody's convinced that even a case like the liar or vagueness and stuff, suppose that they think, well, let's just focus on the gluts. Suppose that they think that the liar is not a strong case, or the revenge liar, or the revenge of the revenge, and so on. Well, okay. I mean, but the logical option is still there as a glut. All you're arguing is that these things are not actually true and false. Now, I would love to see the account that removes the glut, but let's suppose that there is an account and a simple, equally natural account that removes the glut. Okay, but logic still allows for the possibility. And the fact that these aren't gluts in no way means that there aren't other things that are gluts. So I think that it would be a bad methodological strategy to say, I first have to see an actualized one before I'll think that there's another. That's just not the way truth-seeking works. There are no hard and fast rules. I mean, you try to do your best to make sense of the phenomenon in front of you. And sometimes you're surprised. Sometimes there are unprecedented things. Okay, I just wanted to flag that because I was sort of worried about that a little bit.
All right. So in my mind, we're at the kind of halfway point. Your view kind of, to me at least, involves these two steps, which is step one is to set up the at least possibility of gluts, contradictions, sentences that are both true and false. And then step two is to try and show how that can be applied in the case of the Incarnation. So can you just I'm gonna jump to the next question if you don't mind, just in interest of time. How does this system of logic that you're working with, where you have true, false, gaps, and gluts, how does that help to solve the fundamental problem of Christology that we started with?
Okay, good. First, I should say that it's not the system of logic that provides a solution. I think that the system of logic clears the way to see the right solution or the right account. Many Christian thinkers are trapped in an unfounded system of logic that drives them away from the most natural account of Christ's apparent contradiction. A better account that I endorse is, as I said, we have an account of logical consequence that allows for these different possibilities. Logic doesn't force any of those possibilities on us, including, by the way, it doesn't even force us to say of a sentence that it's just true or just false. Just those are the possibilities. You have to confront reality and figure out which of those possibilities are actualized. My response to the apparent contradiction of Christ is that the contradiction is in fact true. Christ is divine and therefore omniscient. But it's also false that Christ is omniscient, since Christ is human. And Christ is divine, so unable to sin, but it's also false that Christ is unable to sin, Why? Christ is human. To say only that Christ is able to sin is to say something true. However, it's to leave out an important truth too, namely that it's false that Christ is able to sin. When you have a being who's contradictory, you can achieve a true and consistent description by leaving out half the story. However, the whole truth involves contradiction, that he's one person who's not only fully divine, but also fully human. For centuries and centuries, sincere Christian thinkers have attempted to cut away part of the contradictory truth, fleeing from the apparent contradiction due to an unfounded commitment to mainstream logical theory. In my view, such flights are driven not by the reality of Christ's radical being, but rather by background theory that should be rejected. In my view, as you said, there are claims that are true and false of Christ, and saying anything less than the full contradiction is to leave out important truths. Now, before you turn to another question, let me just say some of your viewers might think that I'm making up new uses of the word true and false or something. I'm not. The predicate, essentially omniscient, is both true of and false of Christ. No playing with words. The predicate, is able to sin, is both true of and false of Christ. No new words. This is simple old truth and falsity. But now is where we have to be explicit about logic. You can't coherently accept the contradictory truth of Christ while also accepting the ill-founded standard theory of logical consequence. But that's fine. As I said, we should never have accepted the classical logic account of logical consequence to begin with. It was simply crafted not as an account of logical consequence in general. So-called classical logic was formulated by philosophically talented mathematicians as an account of the logical vocabulary in true mathematics. Why would you think that if the account describes the entailment behavior of logical vocabulary in true mathematics, it thereby does it for all true theories? Mathematics has so few predicates involved, and when you try to add important predicates, even like exemplification or something, let alone God or truth or something like this, the program falls apart quickly. The theory just falls into triviality. Witness Frege's early theory of sets and his unrestricted comprehension principle. I won't go into that, but your viewers can look into that if they doubt. So I think the right view of logical consequence allows the full contradictory truth of Christ to be accepted without exploding the theory into nonsense. And so it's not the system that allows for the solution. It's rather the system just clears away what strikes me as the most natural response to the apparent contradiction.
Okay. So one point I think worth me re-emphasizing there, I've heard you mention this in other interviews as well, is what we just did when we talked about there being true sentences, false sentences, gappy sentences, and gluts. That's not going to apply in the case of math. In math, you're not going to have, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're not going to have the equivalent of gluts. You're not going to have true contradictions in math. But your question is, hey, why think that, in basically this domain of mathematical truths, in this domain here, why think that section of reality, this reality is this much bigger thing, this little section here that involves math, why think that it represents the rest of reality?
Yep. Well done.
Okay, so now I want to begin thinking about some objections to this solution, where you say the reason. So the problem of fundamental Christology was, hey, this thing looks apparently contradictory. It looks like you can't have Christ having all the limitlessness of God and the limitations of humans. He's somehow both limited and not limited. That's a contradiction, right? And you say, yep, that's an apparent contradiction. Everyone agrees that's an apparent contradiction. So what's the best explanation of that appearance that it's a contradiction? And you say, the simple answer is, it is a contradiction. There are sentences about Christ that are both true and false. It is true that he's temptable, and it's true that he is not temptable. Or it's yeah, that's the basic idea. Now, people are going to object. One objection I can imagine is that, and this came up when I advertised the video on Facebook. Some people want to begin thinking, oh, this leads to explosion. Anything, any sentence, and every sentence can now be contradictory. Justin Mooney's sentence at the beginning of the live stream, I'm watching this video and I'm not watching this video. That can be true now, and anything and everything can be true. What do you want to say about this kind of objection? Because I think for a lot of people, they're going to instantly jump to that.
Well, in some ways, it's a good objection. It's a very good concern. I mean, on the standard account of logic, a logical consequence, that is the classical logic account misapplied universally. Yeah, from an arbitrary contradiction, everything is logically entailed, every sentence whatsoever. And the reason for that is that logical entailment is an absence of counter example relation. So you say that a sentence A logically entails a sentence B if and only if there's no counterexample. That is, if and only if there's no possibility recognized by the relation where A is true and B is untrue. And according to the classical logic account, since you can never have any possibility in which a contradiction is true, then you're never going to find a counterexample to arbitrary contradiction. Therefore, Jordan is a fried egg. I mean, that's a logically valid argument according to the classical account. Why? Because there's no counterexample. There's no counterexample to the because there's no possible way for the contradiction to be true. So there can't be a possible way for it to be true, and for it to be untrue for Jordan to be a fried egg. Of course, Jordan, it's easy for Jordan it to be untrue for Jordan to be a fried egg, but you still need the premise to be true somewhere to get the counterexample. So the comments that you received on that are excellent. But look, I mean, we've already seen that was just a sort of, I think, a misguided sort of putting blinders on to other possibilities that logic provides. And once you allow for those possibilities, that pattern from a contradiction to any sentence you want is no longer logically valid. So that's simply not a worry.
Would you say, just to maybe for me to help clarify the point, would you say that the default position may be, unless there's good reason for me to think otherwise, this sentence is going to be true or false? But then if I find some good reason to think that it's not the kind of sentence that's just true, and it's not the kind of sentence that's just false, then now I'm within my rights, I guess, to affirm that it's either a gap or it's a glut based on the specific case we're looking at.
I think that that's an excellent way of talking, provided it's understood the right way. I mean, look, logic is one thing. It sort of paints the boundaries of the broadest space of possibilities, and it constrains the logical vocabulary. But true theories have to go well beyond the logical vocabulary. Otherwise, they say absolutely nothing. So how do they go beyond? Well, that's our job. That's why it's so hard to get, to sort of get true theories, because it's logic just doesn't deliver much. It constrains things, but it doesn't deliver much. Okay, so how do we get there? Well, I do think that there are three methodological rules of thumb that are very common when we're trying to construct a true theory. We're guided by three methodological principles, rules of thumb. This isn't logic demanding it. This is our best strategy. One is pursue complete theories. Try to get the full truth of the phenomenon. That is, for any sentence P in the language of the theory, try to put either P in there or not to P. It's negation. So it's true to P or it's false to P. Try to put one of them in the theory for each sentence P in the whole language of the theory. So you shoot for a complete account. Dually, you pursue a consistent account. Try to get a consistent account. Try to avoid putting both P and it's false to P in the theory. And finally, there's a simplicity and naturalness rule of thumb. Try to give a simple theory, a natural theory, not one with all these bells and whistles and gadgets and scaffolding all over the place. Just try to give a simple, natural theory. Now, if reality were up to us, we'd make reality be such that we could just satisfy all three of those very easily, because that would be simple and nice and lovely. But of course, reality is not up to us. So we wind up having to sacrifice one of those rules in favor of the others. Many people will sacrifice simplicity in the name of consistency or in the name of completeness. My own view is maybe that's good in a lot of cases, but you have to be open to there being cases where the inconsistent route is best in order to achieve the complete story. It has to be inconsistent in order to be complete and simple and natural. So that's a long-winded way of saying that, there aren't simple rules that people can follow to pursue the truth. But when it comes to gluts and gaps and all that stuff, it's the same general methodological rules of thumb that guide us here as they do in other areas of inquiry.
Okay. So the objection I mentioned about basically explosion, like, well, can anything and everything just become contradictory? That objection I see as mainly targeting this first step in the picture you're trying to paint for us here, where you set up the possibility. You talked about like clearing the way. You try to clear the way for this solution that you're going to offer. And that objection I mentioned about explosion, I see as applying there, where you're trying to clear the way. Now, this next one that I wanted to mention, this was brought up by Dr. Tim Paul in my interview on his view of the Incarnation, which he calls the Christology, or the conciliar Christology. So maybe you want to mention, because I think you watched that video, so maybe you can mention what his objection was and how you would respond to it.
He gives two objections. One is sort of strictly about logic and his inability to understand something. and the other is about the reasoning of some of the early theologians that were involved in writing of conciliar texts. In the service of time, would you like me to stick to just one or the other of those?
Let's do, yeah, just do one, whichever one you think is the strongest.
The strongest. Okay, well, the stronger one is not the I have trouble understanding, because yeah, let me skip that one. It's not that it's bad, it's just it's not telling at all. So Dr. Beall raises a substantive concern that, if substantiated, would raise serious problems for strands of what he calls conciliar Christology. So the idea in a nutshell is that there are many instances where theologians and ecumenical leaders use a form of so-called reasoning from absurdity, and therefore logic, according to Dr. Beall, can't allow for the possibility of gluts. That's the second one he gives in that interview that you did with him. Well, here details matter a whole lot. And so ultimately, Dr. Beall would have to show that there's no natural way to explain the target behavior while endorsing the count of logic that I endorse. And I believe that he wouldn't be able to show as much, largely because the apparent reasoning of theologians is one thing, and a very, very, very messy thing at that. This has nothing to do with theological reasoning of physicists and biologists. It's all very messy. So that's one thing, the reasoning, and the correct account of logical consequence is a very different thing. As the philosopher Gilbert Harman long ago correctly emphasized, and in some ways so did Lewis Carroll's paper on Achilles and the tortoise, one should never confuse a theory of logical consequence with a theory of reasoning or a theory of rational acceptance rejection behavior. Logical consequence, the sort of validity relation among sentences, is what logicians call monotonic, where this simply means that if an argument from P to Q is logically valid, then so too is every argument that results from adding to P. So the argument from P together with R to conclusion Q is also valid. And the argument from P together with R together with S to the conclusion Q is also valid, and so on. No matter what you add to the premises, if you started with a valid argument, it's always valid. That's monotonicity of logical consequence. But good reasoning is most definitely not monotonic in any way. The relation of provides good reason to accept or provides good reason to reject are simply not monotonic. After all, accepting a statement P can provide good reason to accept a statement Q, but P together with another statement R can provide decisive reason to reject Q. And the same goes for the relation of provides good reason to reject. And here, examples are absolutely everywhere. So consider you're smart, you've studied well, etc. Now let P be the claim that you've correctly answered all possible questions from which your final examination draws in your practice, and so on. Well, P therefore provides very good reason to accept Q, namely that you'll do well on the final exam. But of course, P in no way entails Q, but accepting it provides good reason to accept Q. But now add to the premise set statement R, namely, your calendar is faulty and the final exam happened last week and you missed it. Obviously, your excellent answers on the practice exams and all that, together with the exams already happened, provides very good reason to reject that you'll do well in the final exam. You've just missed it. So, theory of reasoning and provides good reason for is one thing, And that's what Paul was talking about with the theologians. That's a very different thing from logical consequence. And by the way, how those two things, logical consequence and good reasoning, line up is a very difficult question. So in the end, Dr. Paul's objection from theological reasoning simply isn't telling against the advanced account. There are all sorts of things that might be going on with the target reasoners. And so pending further details, I just don't think the objection really is an objection against the logical account.
All right. So in the interest of time, I am going to only bring up one alternative model for the incarnation, and that's Tim Paul's model, his conciliar Christological model. So, and I do this specifically because there's a lot of people in the chat that, as we've been talking, they're referencing something like this. Sometimes it's a kind of variation on the qua approach.
Yep, exactly.
And they're talking in the live chat about how this whole limitlessness of God and limitation of humans, that can all just be solved if you just say Jesus or Christ is limitless with respect to or in virtue of his divine nature, and he's limited with respect to or in virtue of his human nature. And so you're not, what would be a contradiction is if you said he's limited with respect to his human nature and he's limited with respect to, or limitless. Well, sorry, I'm just going to stop. So that's the basic kind of objection that people are raising. Now, you can summarize as you like Tim Paul's view, and then offer your critique of it.
Yeah. So if that's what people are thinking about, it might be useful not to go into the nitty-gritty of Tim Paul's view. I mean, one way of criticizing Tim Paul's view that I endorse is that just as legal courts have to star the term child to get away from problems, so too Tim Paul is basically stipulating new language. And in many ways, he's very upfront about this. He calls it a very non-standard semantics, this and that. And basically, Tim Paul, let's focus on the example we had. Peccable and impeccable, right? So something on the standard usage that, and Tim Paul accepts this. Something X is peccable if and only if it's true that X can sin. Something X is impeccable if and only if it's false that X can sin. And Tim Paul accepts these standard definitions. What he rejects is that they apply to Christ. Instead, he adverts to his star derivatives, namely, something X is star peccable if and only if it has, in whatever sense, a concrete nature, whatever that might be, that is peccable. Something X is star impeccable if and only if it has this other thing that's impeccable. So basically, something is star peccable if and only if this other thing that you have has the property of being impeccable. And something is star impeccable if and only if this other thing that you have is impeccable. That's basically Tim Paul's solution. There's no contradiction or even appearance of contradiction here. And in fact, remember what we're trying to answer, right? The answer is, how can Christ be peccable and impeccable? Or whatever pairs you want to go with. How does Tim Paul answer this? Well, his answer in the end is Christ can't be peccable and impeccable. Instead, he can be star peccable and star impeccable. And you get to be those by having, which isn't spelled out, these other things that aren't you, by the way. And one is peccable and the other is impeccable. So for me, I want to know, well, who are these other things? Who's this thing that is peccable, walking around and talking and all that stuff? Who's that? If it's not Christ, I thought it was Christ we were talking about who's peccable and impeccable. But no, in fact, fundamentally, we're talking about this other thing. So who is that? And who's this other thing that's impeccable? All of the answers, the qua that you mentioned, Tim Paul's view is very much not qua. He's careful in letter to avoid that. And I think he's one of the, leading accounts if you're going to avoid the contradiction. But ultimately, my criticism is he's just shifting the subject. The problem was supposed to be that Christ is peccable and impeccable. It's Christ who's divine and human. So it's Christ who is able to sin and unable to sin. But on Paul's view, it's like you want to know how Christ sort of by charity gets to be peccable and impeccable. Well, you have to look at these other things that aren't Christ, and they get to be it. And this just seems to me just changing the subject. And the qua stories, the most popular qua story faces the same problem. And I would also say that many of the compositional accounts do. If there were more time, I'd say that the one view that doesn't is something like James Anderson's Mysterian view, but there isn't time. I have my own criticisms. I'm sorry?
Let me say something about Tim Paul's view here, and then if you're okay with there being a little more time, I'll let you elaborate on Anderson's view, and then we'll go to questions. Does that sound good? So let me just say this real quick about Tim Paul's view. So when I asked him about your objections to his view, he said, okay, well, Dr. Beall is going to say that I'm changing the subject with my view, because he's going to say that we've shifted from talking about Christ to talking about something that isn't Christ, namely these other natures. And I've changed the subject.
He's right. I say that because it's true. Yeah. Go ahead.
And so those that are watching for like the fuller response that he gives to Dr. Beall's objection, go and listen. I'm probably not going to do it justice, but basically, if I recall, I didn't watch the interview super recently. So if I recall, he basically wants to say, no, I'm not changing the subject, because I'm still talking about Christ, the person that has the nature. So he wants to say, when we say limited and limitless, we're saying, yeah, Christ is both limited and limitless, because, and I remember he gave this analogy with his hands. It's like if I have a fist that is closed and a fist, or a hand that's open, and you say, well, Jordan's got a closed fist and an open fist. Well, which is it? And it's both, and it's Jordan, that's the unified person that we're speaking of. Jordan has a hand that's closed, or he's got a closed fist and an open fist. That sounds contradictory, but we want to say, no, we're still talking about Jordan here. It's just that we've got two things going on. We got this hand here and this hand here. So what do you want to say about that? I probably didn't do it justice.
No, I think that you did. But look, the hand explanation is all well and good, but it can't be what Paul's talking about, because Paul explicitly rejects that these so-called concrete natures are parts of Christ in the way that your hands are part of you. And once you reject that, then again, I'm not sure why we're talking about your hands and so on, because Christ's concrete natures, according to Paul's own view, are not parts of him. So he's explicit in rejecting a Mariological account and so on. He motivates it, and that's why it all seems, but then he says, but it's not that. So his view would collapse. If that's the story, then his view collapses into compositional, Mariological accounts. And he himself gives some of the most trenchant objections to those accounts. So I just don't think that I'm not sure why he's talking about his hands there. But
well, how about this? In the interest of time, so viewers, if you're curious about Tim Paul's view, go check out my interview with him. I actually did 2, and it's the second interview with him that I'm referring to here. But there's another view that's this Mysterian view. And so if you don't mind, go ahead and describe that for us and maybe what you think about that view.
Yeah, let me just quickly describe it. I mean, I really would highly value questions and stuff from your viewers if they have any. But so let me just really quickly, and I'm not going to do it justice, but Mysterianism, as I'm using the term, and this just follows Dale Tuggy's use of the term to characterize James Anderson's account. This is simply an epistemic mystery account. What sets this sort of approach apart from the others, whether it's compositional, qua, relative identity, Tim Paul's, is that instead of trying to explicitly remove the apparent contradiction, the epistemic mystery account, at least as developed by Anderson, leaves the apparent contradiction firmly and conspicuously in the theory. On the other hand, the epistemic mystery account joins all of those other accounts that are questing after consistency, the equivocation-seeking theorists, by positing an equivocation that eliminates the apparent contradiction. On the epistemic account, it's our epistemic limitations make the equivocation itself beyond what we can see. So Tim Paul, compositional, qua, relative identity, all of these are finding equivocations in the key axioms about Christ. Anderson's approach says, no, these are univocal. They're all there, but there is an equivocation that somehow gets around the contradiction. It's just that given our epistemic limitations, we can't see what it is. Tim Paul, compositional, qua, all these people, they say, oh no, we can see it, and it's this, blah, 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 blah. All right. So that's the basic gist. My own view is that this strategy has a particularly difficult time when compared with the simple contradictory account that I advocate. After all, we both agree that Christ appears to be a contradictory being, a being of whom some contradictions are true. Appears that way. We both agree with that. But now you ask the good question, what explains the apparent contradiction? I say the reality, namely that Christ is a contradictory being. And that's the simple truth. On the epistemic mystery account, the explanation of the strongly apparent contradiction of Christ is due to a complicated epistemological framework that we can somewhat articulate, but only partially enough to see that it's okay to accept an apparently contradictory theology. And as I see things, and as I say explicitly in the book, this sort of response simply doesn't sit well with the tried and true methodological rule of thumb, namely that if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, then probably it's a duck. And despite staring at what looks, walks, and sounds very much like a duck, the epistemic mystery strategy is to rely on an ill-founded theory of logic, according to which ducks are impossible. And I just don't see good argument for that theory of logic in the first place. So I'll leave it there, though, on that. There's a lot more to say, but I'll leave it there.
All right, so what I'd like to do now is go to the viewers' questions. So there have been a few in the live chat already where I saw the word question at the beginning, and it was followed by a real question. So I'm going to go back and grab those. But if you have a question that you want to ask Dr. Beall, and I see that the live chat's been very lively with people calling this nonsense and other things. So if you have a question for Dr. Beall, please type it in the chat. I'm going to bring those up now while you're typing your question. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. Even if you don't agree, if you feel like you've learned something here, this has been a productive conversation, then please give it a like and consider subscribing to the channel. Also, please consider becoming one of my patrons. If you do so right now, you could win 3 books simply by becoming a patron and then asking a question that you'd love to ask a scholar. I'm going to select the 2 best questions that I get. They will win the books, and I'll have a scholar come on and answer your questions in a video. All right, let's go to the questions here. So I'm going to back up because there was one pretty early on that I thought was good.
Well, I would be, while you're looking, I will say I would be absolutely thrilled to hear an actual explanation of why it's nonsense. I mean, sadly, people have very little exposure and engagement with logic and philosophy of logic, and they simply respond that way. And, I just hope that they would take more seriously the question.
Okay, so here's one from Majesty of Reason. Question for Dr. Beall. Is modus ponens valid?
Good question. So there are, of course, many, many conditionals. One is logic itself in the logical vocabulary only has one conditional, the material conditional. And this is usually defined by logical negation and logical disjunction. So if you go back to your first course in classical logic, you'll see that it's the material conditional is simply defined as falsity of antecedent or truth of consequent, and that's the way it goes. And according to the view of logic that I advocate, material modus ponens, that is, modus ponens using the material conditional, logic's conditional, is logically invalid. But of course, in many theories, that, like in mathematics, where the theory itself is building a stronger entailment relation, like every true theory has to do, no true theory relies just on logical vocabulary. And except for mathematical theories, virtually none of them rely on the material conditional as the main conditional expressing conditional claims. So the material conditional is valid in many true theories, that is logic's conditional, but it's not logically valid. If you want material modus ponens to be valid in a theory, like in piano arithmetic or what have you, or standard set theory, then you put constraints on the space of possibilities. And that's what happens in these mathematical theories. But of course, the material modus ponens is only one conditional. There are many conditionals, and modus ponens is valid for many of them. Valid how? Well, not logically, because that's not part of logical vocabulary. So logic itself doesn't talk about these other conditionals. But for example, there are conditionals that have a lot of modal strength. You could define a conditional, and I'll just say arrow here for conditional. A arrow B is true at a possibility if and only if there's no possibility whatsoever where A is true and B is untrue. Now, so long as your possibilities are structured in the right way, that will satisfy modus ponens. And that sort of conditional is common in a lot of theories. But people, it saddens me, I must admit, that people act as if modus ponens is the same thing anytime a person uses the word. There are lots of conditionals, lots of them. And if this is news, then really it's worthwhile looking into that, because it's not controversial. This isn't me pushing this point. This is just absolutely common. So when you ask, is modus ponens valid, you have to ask, are you talking about logically valid? Are you talking about valid within the theory? And which conditional are you talking about? And moreover, I'll say a lot of people confuse modus ponens with other things. that we do. Like one person might accept a certain, even a material conditional claim and accept its antecedent, and they automatically reject, this is a mental activity we do, reject that the antecedent is contradictory. And you can prove, and I've written papers on this, you can prove that even in the subclassical account that I like, that sort of move is just absolutely part of the core of the account. But you can't confuse what you're doing with the language and the language itself.
Okay. Well, let's try to go through these other questions a little faster because we got a lot.
Oh, sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. Okay, so Tim Paul points out that the church fathers objected to some views of the Incarnation precisely because they entailed contradictions. Does this fact pose a problem for your account?
Yeah, that's a great question. I tried to answer that in the interview by pointing out that details matter here. He would actually have to show what exactly was going on, and I think that it's probably not a problem at all for the account of logical entailment. Instead, it may be a particular instance of that particular contradiction and their reasoning about it and so on. But as I said, reasoning and logical consequence are very different things.
All right. Kyle Hodge asked, what is the relationship between combinatorial possibility and logical possibility?
Good. Logical possibility is generally taken to be the broadest possibility, space of possibility. And so, and I see no reason to doubt that. So I would think of combinatorial possibilities as some logical possibilities. Yeah.
So you could have a combination, but it not be logically possible. That's possible.
No, just the opposite. If there's not a logical possibility of a combination, you don't have a combination. But if you got a possible combination, then you've got the logical possibility of it.
Okay. So this question's a good follow-up here. This will help me clarify that. So Kyle Hodge asks, can something be both gappy and glutty at the same time and in the same respect?
That's a very good.
That seems like you can combine it.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I'm just looking one paper up. Okay, so there's a paper I wrote with Caleb Cameron. It's called A Note on FDE. This is first degree entailment. It's the account of logic that I think is correct. A note on FDE all the way up. And what this paper proves is that if you start with these four possibilities and the standard truth and falsity conditions, you can combine them in any way you want, all the way up through infinity. So every infinite cardinal, if you don't know what that is, don't worry about it, but every infinite cardinal number, you can do every combination, and the end result is FDE. So in some sense, we'd have to be clear about what we're talking about when we're combining, but the end result is combine away and you still get the same account of logic. And that paper is in a note on FDE all the way up. That's in the Notre Dame Journal of Formal Logic.
All right. Brando asked, what does this do? And by this, I think he's talking about your account here. What does this do to truth seeking as far as removing and retaining certain sentences in order to make progress?
Yeah, these are really excellent questions. I mean, I don't think it, I think if anything, it helps people to get closer to the truth on some things. Why do I say that? Well, look, if these logical possibilities are out there and you're simply ignoring them, And if it turns out that the reality actualizes some of them and you're just ignoring them, you're just sort of spinning in circles for no good reason. As I said in the interview itself, I think that truth-seeking always has been and always will be a matter of methodological rules of thumb. I mean, if there were some very simple, precise rule that could tell us how to distinguish truths from untruths, look, intellectual life and the pursuit of truth in general would be easy. But of course, it's not that way. There just hasn't been. You follow rules of thumb, and those rules of thumb that you always have followed are the same ones. Acknowledging gluts and gaps don't change that.
Okay, you may be able to elaborate on that here too, or the question is from BDS, why are some contradictions true on your account, but not all contradictions?
I would say that, that's for reality to answer. Why are some sentences just true? Well, it's just the way the world is. Why is the sentence Jordan is sitting? Why is that sentence true and not Jordan is standing? Well, it's the way the world is. And I would say the same as contradictions don't change that.
All right. Let me scroll down. Okay, yeah. It looks like we've got 3 more questions, if that's okay with you. Okay, Kyle Hodge asked, do you accept any reductive definition, criterion, analysis of logical modal concepts, like logical possibility, and so on? If not, what is your way of understanding modal concepts?
I'd need to know more about what he's thinking with respect to reductive. I tend to think of modal properties as real and out there and all that, and to understand sort of the entailment behavior of modal discourse, I think that the standard story about quantification over points, possible worlds, whatever you want to say, is the right story. So maybe you're thinking of like a David Lewis style reduction of a lethic modality to quantification over worlds. But I'd have to hear more in order to know. But I don't think I'm taking any special or non-standard approach to modal discourse. It's still, we're talking about worlds, possibilities, what have you.
Okay, Justin Mooney asked this question. The Nicene Creed condemns the position that Christ was created. Doesn't your view entail that Christ was created, albeit also that he wasn't created?
That's a good question, whether the view entails it. Some of this is tricky. I would point you to chapter 5, I think. There are some issues of contraposition and stuff that arise. Let me not get into that right now. Let me instead just say the following. It's not obvious to me that the view entails it, unless being created is essential to being human. That is, if Christ has human nature and human nature entails being created, then yes. So isn't that a problem for the Orthodox? Well, here we just have to be clear about what's being condemned. So there are different kinds of heresies, and one is sort of heresy by commission. So it's having let's just say that Christ was created, having that in the theory as true according to the theory. And there are heresies of omission. So lacking the claim that, for example, Christ is divine, and so on. If you're right that my view entails that Christ was created, it will be a heresy of commission, because, as you say, it would also contain that Christ is not created. So you'd have both claims, and one of them we're assuming is the sort of negation is heretical. That's by commission. To me, I've always thought the real heresy is the one where you you lack the statement in the theory. You fail to assert the truth. But I should also say one other thing. These creeds, sometimes they can be read as what you should accept and what you should reject, rather than this is true and this is false. So sometimes, I think notoriously, some of the discourse uses what looks like logical negation, when in fact it's actually an expression of what you ought to reject. It's not a claim about truth and falsity. It's a claim about what you as an agent ought to accept and reject. And if that's what's going on in this particular condemnation, then it's not clear that would be a problem either. But thanks. All these questions have been great.
Okay, this will be the last question from Bombadil Tom. From a ministerial level, for the Joe in the pew, their view might be, the Bible says it, I affirm it, contradiction or not. Is that lay intuitive version of your position? Is that the lay intuitive version of your position?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think that, look, the true Christology answers to the reality of Christ. The reality of Christ as the incarnate God is revealed through Scripture, together with reflection, codified in various ways by ecumenical councils. Important ways if you're Catholic, but still very important ways if you're like Reformed, Protestant. So in some sense, yeah, that it says it, I affirm it, contradiction or not. But I would be saddened if people thought, well, it's a contradiction, who cares, because I'm going to believe it anyhow, as if the contradiction is some sort of bad statement or something like that. I mean, look, putting together divinity and humanity in one person, it looks like you're going to get a contradiction. But is that something you should be like, hey, even though contradictions are bad, I'm going to keep going? I think that's the lay sort of import of the expression, and I wouldn't want that. But the expression reflects the reality of, the account has to answer to the reality of Christ as revealed in Scripture and codified in reflection on it.
All right, Furthering Christendom, which I believe is Mike DeVito's channel, him and Tyler McNabb. So if you want some other great interviews, they're doing great work. Go and listen to their videos, subscribe to their channel. Thank you so much, Mike DeVito, again for sending me the book. And thank you, Dr. Beall, for letting me interview you. I was very interested in your view, and definitely you got me thinking. That's for sure.
Great. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to engage with your viewers, and I'm grateful for the engagement from them. If there are people who worry about this making sense, and you can formulate that and really show a problem, I'd be delighted, because I'm not in it just to hold it. I want to get it right. So thanks.
All right. Well, we'll end it there. If you'll just stick around for a moment after it's over, I'll say goodbye to you as well, Dr. Beall. So thank you, everyone, for watching. And next week, I've got an exciting interview, I believe, with Dr. Thomas Bogardus on arguments for dualism. So check that out. It will be a fun one. All right. We'll see you next time.